All right,
So
take it
now,
away.
so now I'm going to move this just enough to hopefully you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Okay. This isn't going to be too long, but I wanted to kind of focus on something because I've been struggling with a couple of different things that are going on in and around the Baptist Convention and a couple other things, and it's like, I don't really get all of it. But if you turn, we're going to start in Mark chapter 8, and then we're going to work our way back to Luke, just because we're enjoying Luke. But in Mark chapter 8, verse 34, of course, that's Mark 7, so no wonder it doesn't look right. It talks about Jesus summoning the disciples and the crowd, and he says, if anyone is to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? Mm-hmm. And when we read these things, it sounds like a very hard saying. It's like, okay, I have to become a monk on a mountaintop, and, I've got to, travel the ends of the earth, and I can't have any family or friends or this or that. So depending on how you read it, it sounds awfully sterile and awful difficult. And Jesus isn't saying it's not difficult, isn't saying it's easy, but he's not saying everybody has to be a monk or something like that. So if you turn to Luke 14, for a minute, it doesn't get any better, by the way. In verse 25, it says, large crowds were going along with him, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which one of you, when he wants to build a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation he's not able to finish, all who observe it will ridicule him, saying, well, this is the guy that began to build it and wasn't able to finish. And then I'm going to skip down to verse 34, where he says, therefore, salt is good. But if even the salt has become tasteless, with what will it be seasoned? It's useless either for soil or for the manure pile. It's thrown out. He who has ears, let him hear. We got to pull these together. And everywhere I look, when it talks about the very first part of this Luke 14 chapter, where it says, you hate your own father and mother and brother and sister and aunts and uncles and cousins and everybody else. The reflection that I get pretty much everywhere is hate as in prioritize your love less than your love for Christ. So your love for Christ will be more than your family ties, your friends' ties, your brothers, your sisters, your children. And so when we look at this and we look at the other Christian about you can't even be a disciple unless you deny yourself and come follow him, and think of the context from a first century Middle Eastern perspective, remember, family's everything. Mm-hmm. Even when I'm in Gupco and working, I'd have people come up and go, my mother's brothers, uncles, cousins on my aunt's side has a problem. I'm sure you can help. And you're like, okay, because I'm sure you can help. And because that extended family is so important, And yet, when Jesus says this in that community, they're all going, what? I have to love you more than this giant extended community, which is how I live. It's how I survive. It's how I get things done. And yet you're telling me I have to love you more than, follow you better than all of that other stuff. And if we go to Genesis chapter 2, we get an interesting parallel. Because in Genesis chapter 2, starting in 44, let me see if I can get it.
Genesis
2 what? 2 what? No, I can't.
It goes up to 25.
Thank you.
Okay. Make sure my eyes are working.
No, your eyes are fine. It's mine that are bad. So if you go before that, God causes Adam to take a nap, steals one of his ribs, makes a girl. Adam wakes up and goes, holy mackerel, that's nice. And then remember, that's back further. And remember that at this point in time, it's Adam and Eve. There's only two people. And yet Adam then says, this is now bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She'll be called woman because she's taken out of man. And for this reason, a man will leave his father and his mother, be joined to his wife, and they will become one flesh. He hasn't got a dad. There's no mom. They haven't had kids yet. And yet his statement, his prophecy is the man will leave his father and his mother. The woman will leave her home, is how it's quoted elsewhere in the Bible. And they will travel together and be joined. And basically, if you think about it in terms of what Jesus is saying is, the guy's supposed to leave his mother's and father's house. He's not supposed to be a mommy's boy anymore. And he's supposed to cleave to his wife. He's supposed to be united with his wife, and they're supposed to travel together where they prioritize each other over everything else. And Jesus is saying the same thing when we look at either Mark or Luke. He's saying, okay, to follow me, you need to prioritize me over other things and other people. And if you read down further in that section, they actually use the word, in the Luke section, they actually use the word possessions. So think about it in today's environment, whereas when God asks you to do something that's interesting, difficult, or challenging, he's asking you to, and you understand that he really does want you to do something. He's asking you prioritize what I've asked you to do over your family and friends, over your possessions, over your status in the community. You really are supposed to go, no, I'm choosing Jesus. And in the way he's saying it, he's telling you this is going to cost you something. And the comparison he makes to the guy who's building a vineyard and building a tower is, did you figure out how much it was going to cost you before you started so that you wouldn't run out of money and quit early? Or in this sense, about the time your walk with Christ becomes difficult, do you go, whoa, wait a minute, okay, hold on, no, I didn't realize it was going to cost this much. I didn't realize the sacrifice was going to be this much. I wasn't sure I signed up for all of this. And so you back down and go, I'm going to shift my car into neutral because that's just too hard. That's just too costly. That's just too expensive. That's just too something. And so what Jesus is trying to say to us, make sure you understand what you're getting yourself into. Just sort of like when you get married, make sure you understand what you're getting yourself into, right? course, I could pick on Erin back here. She has 6 kids. I'm not sure she knew what she was getting herself into. But do we have we counted the cost? Do we understand what he might ask? Because he didn't ask us all to go live on a mountain. He didn't ask us all to go into the middle of China or the middle of Africa or, whatever. But at some point in time, there is a cost. He has asked us to do something, and we will look at it and go, I'm not sure that cost is worth it.
Okay.
And the downside to that, and you look at the church in America especially, and you jump down near the end, it says salt is good. And we are told we are to be salt. We're supposed to flavor things. And salt is good. But what happens when the salt stops being salty? What happens when we get so bound up in our possessions and our families and our kids and our job and everything else, and when God comes along and says, well, I need you to do something for me, and we go, I can't right now, God, because, fill in the blank. We've got an excuse. It's not a reason, it's just an excuse. He said, with salt becomes not salty, not useful. And then he says, which is really kind of interesting, he said it's not good for the soil. We know this. If you put salt into the soil, it really sterilizes the soil and it's not good for growing stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So if you stop being salty, if you stop being able to influence around you and actually help people move them towards God, he's saying, well, you're no good for helping with being fruitful. You stop being fertilizer, if you will. He says, and you're not good for the manure pile. Okay, that doesn't sound very good. We're not even going to throw you in the manure pile because the manure pile is at least somewhat of a fertilizer as it breaks down. So you're not good for the soil. You're not good for fertilizer. You're not good for the manure pile. You're just tossed out. And elsewhere in the Bible, it talks about just the only thing you can be used for is to throw it on the road, where it stops things growing in the road and really kind of useless.
Okay.
And so it's really interesting when you say, okay, in this Middle Eastern culture, he compares this to what Adam says, which is you're to leave your father and mother and you're to leave your family, you're to get together and join, and then the two of you are supposed to go on together and prioritize each other. He's saying here, you're supposed to prioritize me. And if you gather people around you who understand that, when God asks you to sacrifice or do something, everybody around you says, yes, go for it, because we understand this from God. But if we get so caught up in our possessions, so caught up in our families, so caught up in our culture, our American culture, then we become unfruitful and we become unsalty because we're not able to flavor anything around us. And then we aren't useful. We aren't helpful. And Jesus really is sort of like, it's useless for either the soil or the manure. It's thrown out. And I don't think any of us want to be in the position where we're thrown out. And if you remember being in Cairo, where community is everything, and the people around you are part of community, you're more aware of the needs of community. And if you're really kind of listening, you have a whole lot of opportunities to minister. In the US, where you're not really a member of community, most people aren't even a member of town. And if you think about the way we live our lives as individuals, it's me, myself, and I first. Not even family, friends, church, country. It's really me, myself, and I. And when God challenges us to do something and we have to sacrifice me, myself, and I, generically, we're not very good at it. And that's partially if you go back into the early 80s, that's where the prosperity doctrine came from, that in the early 80s was around. If ever read anything about it, it really was all about, if God loves you, you'll be rich and famous and everything will be wonderful. You'll never get sick. And if you're not doing well, then God doesn't like you anymore and you need to, do something about it. And you've kind of preached that to our brothers and sisters in Cairo or Sudan or some of those other places. Like, really? Doesn't preach very well over here.
Mhm.
And so I think what we need to do is remember, well, for me, it's like, I don't want to be called unsalty salt. I don't want to become useless for the soil, for even the manure pile, and just be thrown in the street. I don't want to be useless. But that also means I need to prioritize what God's asking me to do.
Mhm.
And that's difficult for us in America. It's difficult for us as humans, just generically. And yet, that's what he's asking us to do. Kasum's thinking, ooh.
No, because it just so resonates. I mean, in our culture, that's what we do, right? Like, I mean, the fact that my family still lives as an extended family, it's all about community. I mean, I think to a point where it's almost extreme that we're taking care of everybody else except for ourselves. Like, I watch my sister-in-laws, like, there are days I'm like, y'all just need to go take a break. Like, I mean, they cook 3 meals a day, and it's not just one thing. There'll be like 4 different things for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So I can see that extremeness of it, where then you lose who you are as a person when you live in that sort of culture. But I wanted to say, Bob, I love that part where you talk about like that we're salt, like we bring flavor into life. Because I mean, just sitting in this living room, this giant living space I have here, I have these tables that are in storage right now, and I was only going to bring one, and I was like, no, I'm going to bring both of them, because for me, it's about creating community here. It's like, so adding that spice to life, right? Like, we're not in this alone, and so that's exciting for me to see, is like, what do I get to create here in this phase in this journey of my life?
Well, yeah, well,
You gotta get
you
closer.
gotta get close to the mic.
This is when our pastor shared in a sermon that just like knocked me between the eyeballs. So it says, it's by John Stott. It says, God intends us to penetrate the world. Christian salt has no business to remain snugly in elegant little ecclesiastical salt cellars. Our place is to be rubbed in to the secular community as salt is rubbed into meat to stop it going bad. And when society does go bad, we Christians tend to throw up our hands in pious horror and reproach the non-Christian world. But should we not rather reproach ourselves? One can hardly blame unsalted meat for going bad. It cannot do anything else. The real question to ask is, where's the salt?
That's good.
I love that. That's amazing.
Yeah, he read that to us a couple months ago, and I was like, okay, that's spot on.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Will you send that to us, Christy?
Yeah, send that to us, please.
Yeah.
Send it to me, I'll put it in the
Yeah.
prayer request. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
when
I mean,
church schools are okay, but when all the Christians take all of their kids out of public schools and put them in church schools, who's going to influence the public school system?
exactly.
That's what we were debating when the kids were young. Mostly what school district were we going into? And then if we did want them to go into private, because it was hard, right? Public schools are rough. And then we really had it knocked to us saying, you know, we'd rather have them face the world now under our roof
Mhm.
and deal with things that they might come across under our wings instead of being, I mean, we're sheltered to a point at a Christian school. I mean, I taught in a Christian school.
Mhm.
So that was our whole, and it was a good thing. I mean, it was hard, definitely, but it was a good thing for both kids. So yeah, but it's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
Mhm.
And that's, you know, I mean, there are situations, there are individuals that it's not a generic thing. There are some kids who really do need to be in a, you know, a Christian environment, and to do that, we need both. But yeah, if we all pull our kids out,
Yeah.
and we pull out and the teachers pull out, you know, yeah. Yeah. The next generation is going to rule at some point in time. I think we would like them to have had some good influences.
And I think what struck me about that
Absolutely.
when in the scripture was saying, you know, you're not finishing the task when it gets too hard, right? And just
You
so,
froze.
oh, am I still frozen?
Nope.
No,
Okay.
No.
Just that it seems now people tend to bail out when things get rough, right? And that's,
Mhm.
you know,
Mhm.
that this generation is not used to dealing with hardship and battling through it instead of just giving up.
Mhm. Right.
yeah, I think the psalm is, yea, though I walk through the valley of death,
Yeah, not out of it.
not around or over,
Not out of it.
pass it by.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely.
As my brother says, the reason we can do that is because we know the one who walks with us.
Mhm.
And he's already walked
Mhm.
through death, and he's already defeated death. And so if he goes with me, then what am I afraid of? You know,
Right.
it isn't any fun to go through it, but the one who's defeated death is the one who's walking me. And the other thing is, it says I'm going through it. It doesn't say I'm going to stay here.
Right.
Right.
It feels
Yeah.
like I'm staying here. And, you know, Robin, today is your dad's, you know, anniversary of going into heaven. It feels sometimes like this is never going to end and I'm just going to be in grief forever. But it's a promise from him. No, I'm going through this. It might take me a while to get there. Consume you too with your mama recently, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he will take us, if he takes us through it, he's going to get us out of there as well.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Stop recording.
Yeah, sounds good.